In the year 1899, in the heart of Tokyo, a mental ward became the epicenter of a strange and disturbing phenomenon that defied all medical understanding. This wasn't an isolated case or a solitary delusion. It was something much more unsettling. The patients, in varying degrees of mental distress, began to experience shared hallucinations, vivid, terrifying visions that seemed to transcend the boundaries of individual minds. At first, it was a single patient, describing fantastical scenes no one else could see. But soon, others in the ward began reporting the same visions. These were not just figments of imagination. They were as real to the patients as the walls around them. The doctors, initially skeptical, were forced to confront a terrifying question. How could a group of people, suffering from distinct mental disorders, all see the same hallucination at the same time? The implications were profound. The medical world had long struggled to understand the workings of the human mind, and the growing popularity of Western psychiatric practices in Japan only added to the confusion. Could something in the environment have triggered this phenomenon? Was it a contagious psychological condition, or was it a symptom of something more sinister, more inexplicable? The strange episode was recorded and studied for years, but the answers remain elusive. Some scientists believed it was simply mass hysteria, the idea that the mind could be so overwhelmed by fear or anxiety that it could collectively conjure the same visions. Others considered more supernatural explanations. After all, Japan had a long history of spiritual beliefs, with many people still deeply rooted in traditions that viewed the spirit world as a tangible, influential force. But could this be a case of collective delusion, or was there something deeper at play, something beyond the grasp of conventional psychiatry? The details surrounding the case are sparse, and much of what we know comes from fragmented records and witness testimonies that seem almost too strange to be true. But one thing is certain. This was not just another chapter in the long history of mental health misdiagnosis. What happened in that ward challenged everything the doctors thought they knew about the human psyche. The patients weren't just suffering from mental illness in the traditional sense. They were experiencing a shared, eerie psychic event. The boundary between reality and imagination seemed to blur, and even the medical staff began to feel a creeping sense of unease. Were they witnessing the unraveling of the human mind, or was there something more terrifying, and perhaps more unexplainable, at play? As the days wore on, more and more patients began to describe the same visions. There were reports of shadowy figures, grotesque creatures, and strange landscapes that no one could account for. The visions were consistent across the group, and in some cases, patients seemed to respond to these hallucinations as though they were physically present. In one particularly unsettling incident, a patient screamed in terror, claiming that an enormous creature with glowing eyes was standing at the foot of her bed. Doctors rushed to her side, but there was nothing there, at least, nothing visible to the naked eye. But the patient was convinced, her fear palpable. And when others in the ward were asked about their own experiences, many reported seeing the same creature, standing in the same spot, at the same time. The most chilling aspect of this shared hallucination was the sheer consistency of the visions. Unlike most cases of individual delusions, where the hallucinations are often fragmented, personal, and fleeting, these were clear, coherent, and undeniably shared by multiple people. One patient might describe a forest, while another would speak of a darkened sky, and yet, their descriptions matched in unnerving detail. No one had communicated their visions to the others, yet they all seemed to see the same things. The hallucinations were so vivid, so terrifying, that they began to drive the patients into a state of complete hysteria. Some would claim to hear whispers in the dark. Others would frantically search the walls for the shadowy figures they saw lurking just beyond their sight. It was as though the very fabric of reality had been ripped open, and these patients were caught in the tear. The medical staff had no answers. There was no precedent for such an occurrence. They had seen mental breakdowns before, of course, and they understood the concept of delirium and psychosis, but this was something altogether different. These patients weren't simply delusional. They were experiencing something shared, something that suggested their minds were connected in ways that science couldn't explain. Was it mass psychosis? Or could it be something more, a sort of shared dream or psychic bond? There was talk among the doctors of suggestion, of patients inadvertently influencing one another's hallucinations. But there was something more to the story, a feeling that wouldn't be easily dismissed. Over the coming weeks, the phenomenon began to escalate. New patients were admitted to the ward, and many of them reported seeing the same disturbing visions within hours of their arrival. It wasn't just that they were experiencing individual delusions, they were participating in a collective psychic event. For some patients, it became an obsession. They would sit together in their rooms, eyes wide with terror, recounting their hallucinations to each other in hushed tones, adding details and nuances that only seemed to deepen the confusion. One patient would describe a vision of a demonic figure, and another would quickly chime in, describing the same creature, down to the tattered robes and burning eyes. These weren't vague or distant impressions. They were clear, detailed, and frighteningly real to the patients who experienced them. And then there was the strange sense of unity that began to form among the patients. Despite their mental illnesses, they became increasingly connected to one another. Some even claimed that their visions would overlap or merge, with one patient describing events that another had already experienced in detail. It was as though the boundaries between individual consciousnesses had begun to dissolve. The asylum staff, though initially skeptical, couldn't help but be drawn into the mystery. As the visions grew more intense and more patients were affected, it became harder to dismiss the idea that this was simply a coincidence or a case of mass hysteria. What they were witnessing was something far more unsettling. The medical staff scrambled for answers, but as they dug deeper, they found no clear explanation. Psychiatric theories at the time were still in their infancy, and no one had yet devised a comprehensive understanding of the brain's inner workings. The standard treatments for mental illness in 1899 were crude at best: isolation, restraint, and some primitive forms of electroshock therapy. None of these approaches seemed to make a dent in the bizarre events unfolding at the ward. The patients who were caught in the grip of the hallucinations weren't responding to treatment in any meaningful way. The delusions persisted, growing ever more intense, and the staff was left feeling powerless in the face of a mystery they couldn't even begin to understand. As word of the strange happenings began to spread, a few outsiders took interest, primarily researchers from Western Europe and America, who were keen to understand the phenomenon from a scientific perspective. They, too, were baffled by what they encountered. The language barrier was a challenge, but the accounts from both the patients and the doctors painted a picture that seemed impossible to ignore. It wasn't just a case of delirium or insanity. This was something different, something that suggested a deeper connection between the human mind and the world around it. Whether it was a psychological contagion, a shared dream, or something more supernatural, no one could say for certain. The mystery of the Tokyo mental ward would go on to be studied and debated for years. Some would argue that it was simply a case of patients influencing each other's delusions through a form of groupthink or suggestibility. Others would claim that it was evidence of something far darker, an inexplicable, shared psychic event that defied all rational explanation. And yet, despite years of study, no conclusive answers would ever emerge. What happened in that ward remains one of the most chilling mysteries of mental health history. The question that lingers is simple: what if the human mind is capable of much more than we can comprehend? And what if the boundaries between reality and hallucination are not as solid as we like to believe? In 1899, Tokyo was a city caught between two worlds: the old traditions of Japan and the new wave of Western influence that was beginning to reshape the country. This tension was most evident in the fields of medicine and psychology, where centuries of ancient practices were confronted with the rigor of scientific progress. Japan, which had long been a land of spiritual beliefs and mysticism, was now exposed to the rationality of Western thought, particularly the emerging field of psychiatry, which sought to understand the human mind through a scientific, objective lens. The impact of this cultural and intellectual shift was profound, particularly in the way mental illness was perceived and treated. At the turn of the century, Japan was undergoing a radical transformation. The Meiji Restoration in the late 19th century had marked the beginning of Japan's modernization, as the nation sought to shed its isolationist past and become a global power. The West had long viewed Japan as a mysterious, inscrutable land, a place of ancient rituals, samurai codes, and spiritual traditions. But with the arrival of Western medical practices and ideas, the ancient ways were slowly being replaced. The new science of psychiatry, which had flourished in Europe, began to make its way into Japan's hospitals and asylums. Psychiatry, once rooted in superstition and spirituality, was now being presented as a discipline grounded in science, observation, and treatment. And yet, despite the embrace of modernity, there was still a strong undercurrent of traditional belief that ran through the culture, particularly when it came to the understanding of the mind. Japan's medical establishment, while eager to adopt Western methods, was still deeply entrenched in spiritual practices. Shamanism, folk medicine, and Buddhist beliefs in the supernatural held sway over many aspects of Japanese life, especially in rural areas. There was a widely held belief that the human mind could be influenced by spirits, demons, or divine forces. Mental illness was often seen not as a disorder of the brain, but as a spiritual affliction, a sign of being possessed or cursed. This belief was not limited to the peasant class. It extended to the educated elites, who sometimes turned to religious rituals or exorcisms to treat psychiatric conditions. At the same time, Western medicine was offering a new biological and neurological understanding of the mind. Doctors in Japan were beginning to incorporate ideas from European psychiatrists, such as Sigmund Freud and Emil Kraepelin, who were revolutionizing the understanding of mental disorders. In this unique cultural and scientific environment, the events at the Tokyo mental ward were all the more perplexing. The psychiatric profession in Japan was still in its infancy, struggling to reconcile Western ideas with the more traditional spiritual views that had long been ingrained in Japanese society. The fact that mental illness was often linked to mystical causes made it difficult for many in the medical community to accept the scientific explanations for the strange occurrences at the asylum. As patients began to exhibit the signs of shared hallucinations, the ward staff was forced to confront a mystery that had no easy answers. Was this simply a case of mass hysteria, a known psychological phenomenon where a group of people begin to experience the same delusions or symptoms? Or was there something more to it, something that could not be explained by the medical knowledge of the time? The medical establishment in Japan was still largely influenced by the teachings of Western psychiatry, which sought to explain mental illness through a biological and neurological framework. According to this view, the mind was a complex machine, and mental disorders were caused by chemical imbalances, brain lesions, or genetic factors. But this theory clashed with the deeply ingrained cultural beliefs about mental illness, which often saw the mind as an entity that could be possessed or afflicted by supernatural forces. The people who were confined to asylums in Japan during this time were often believed to be spiritually disturbed, and the methods used to treat them were a mix of spiritual and scientific approaches. Some patients were subjected to rituals designed to expel evil spirits, while others were treated with drugs or restraint, a practice that was common in Western psychiatric institutions at the time. When the collective hallucinations began in the Tokyo asylum, they posed a serious challenge to both traditional and modern understandings of mental illness. In the context of Western psychiatry, the idea that multiple patients could share the same hallucinations was unfathomable. Mental disorders were thought to be deeply individual experiences, shaped by personal trauma, genetics, or neurological factors. The idea that a group of people could experience the same vision seemed impossible. Yet, the asylum record showed that this was precisely what was happening. For the staff, it was a case of psychological contagion, but they couldn't quite explain how or why it was occurring. Meanwhile, the patients, many of whom had been diagnosed with various mental disorders, began describing the same bizarre visions and hallucinations. Some reported seeing shadowy figures or creatures that no one else could see. Others claimed to hear whispers or screams in the dark. The fact that these visions were shared among multiple patients led some to consider the possibility that they were not just the product of individual psychosis, but rather a shared psychic experience, a collective delusion that transcended the boundaries of individual minds. Was this a psychological phenomenon, or was it something more spiritual? Could the patients' minds have been influenced by forces beyond their control? Forces that were invisible and unseen? In this intersection of Western psychiatry and traditional Japanese beliefs, the events seemed to defy explanation. The patients' reports of shared visions didn't fit into any of the accepted diagnostic categories of the time. Some of them had been diagnosed with conditions like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, while others were suffering from hysteria or neurosis. Yet, the consistent nature of the hallucinations, the fact that they were shared, not personal, was unlike anything the staff had seen before. The doctors were forced to confront the limits of their understanding. They had no framework to explain what was happening, and so they turned to theories of mass hysteria, groupthink, and psychic contagion. But none of these theories could fully account for the mysterious connection between the patient's experiences. As the days went by, the medical staff became more and more unsettled. They tried to isolate the patients and prevent them from coming into contact with one another, but it seemed as if the hallucinations were contagious in ways they couldn't control. New patients arriving at the ward often reported experiencing the same visions as those already there. It was as if the very atmosphere of the asylum was somehow influencing the minds of the patients. Was it possible that the mental environment of the ward, its isolation, its oppressive atmosphere, was triggering these shared hallucinations? Or was there something more at play, something that reached beyond the walls of the institution? The growing sense of unease among the staff was compounded by their inability to find a solution. They had no explanation for the shared hallucinations, no treatment that could make the patients stop seeing the same visions. The doctors were forced to consider the possibility that their understanding of the human mind was deeply flawed. They had embraced the scientific method, believing that every mental illness had a logical cause, but here they were, confronted with something they could not explain or control. The patient's minds seemed to be linked in ways that went beyond the capacity of Western psychiatry to explain. Was it a new form of mass psychosis? A sign of a deeper psychological breakdown? Or was it something even darker, a phenomenon that could not be captured by the scientific worldview? As the medical staff grappled with the mystery, they could not escape the growing influence of Japan's spiritual traditions. The very ideas of possession, spirits, and supernatural forces that had once been dismissed by Western-trained doctors were now creeping into their minds. Could the patient's experiences be linked to spiritual causes, something beyond the scientific understanding of the time? Were they victims of an evil spirit or an ancient curse? These questions, though unsettling, began to find their way into the conversations of doctors who, in their desperation, began to wonder whether the true cause of the hallucinations could not be understood through the narrow lens of Western medicine alone. As Japan's medical world continued to struggle with the dilemma of modern science versus ancient beliefs, the events at the Tokyo Asylum remained an unsolved puzzle, one that would continue to haunt the psychiatric community for years to come. The mystery of the shared hallucinations would remain one of the most perplexing and unnerving episodes in the history of mental health treatment in Japan, a reminder that the human mind is not always as easily understood as we might hope. And perhaps, at the heart of this mystery, lies the unsettling realization that some things are simply beyond the grasp of even the most advanced science. In the year 1899, the Tokyo Asylum was far from what we might consider modern psychiatric care. The institution itself, while relatively new, stood in stark contrast to the city's rapidly modernizing landscape. This was a time when Japan was transitioning from its long history of isolation to becoming a burgeoning world power. The Meiji Restoration had already begun reshaping Japan's political, economic, and social structures, ushering in an era of industrialization, westernization, and scientific advancement. However, even as Japan embraced modernity, there remained a firm grip on traditional beliefs, particularly when it came to matters of the mind and spirit. The mental ward in Tokyo, although built with the intent to house and treat those struggling with mental illness, reflected a nation still caught between the ancient and the new, between spirituality and scientific reason. The asylum's patients, many of whom had been admitted due to various psychological conditions, were not just typical cases of mental illness but individuals who were being shaped by the social, cultural, and spiritual beliefs of late 19th century Japan. The patients' experiences in the asylum were defined not only by their personal histories but by the cultural context in which they lived. Mental illness in Japan was seen, by many, not just as a physical ailment of the mind but also as something deeply tied to the soul. The traditional understanding of mental illness often intertwined with supernatural beliefs, where those afflicted might be seen as cursed, haunted, or even possessed by spirits. This belief wasn't confined to rural communities or the uneducated. Even the educated elite, some of whom were still influenced by older belief systems, held some degree of reverence for spiritual causes of mental disturbances. For those inside the asylum, these beliefs were deeply ingrained. The patients, whether they came from the middle class or lower class, carried with them the weight of centuries-old ideas about demons, ghosts, and spirits that could affect their mental well-being. Many of the patients who found themselves within the walls of the Tokyo Asylum had long been suffering from neurotic symptoms, psychotic episodes, or emotional breakdowns, but their struggles were often framed not as biological or psychological in nature, but as something more esoteric. In a society that still believed in the possibility of spiritual possession, it was not uncommon for families to turn to traditional shamanic rituals or Buddhist priests to cleanse their loved ones, often before seeking any medical intervention. The idea that a patient's mind could be overtaken by malevolent forces was as real as any diagnosis from a Western-trained doctor. The asylum itself was a place of confusion and isolation, both for the patients and for the medical professionals trying to understand their conditions. The doctors and staff at the Tokyo mental ward were caught between these two conflicting worlds. They were learning about Western medical practices, such as psychoanalysis and neurology, which had their roots in the studies of Freud and Kraepelin, but they were also surrounded by patients whose minds seemed to operate outside of the constructs these practices tried to impose. With the arrival of Western psychiatry and its scientific explanations for mental illness, the doctors attempted to apply modern principles, but what they encountered in the asylum didn't easily fit into any neat diagnostic category. Many of the patients were diagnosed with neurosis or hysteria, conditions that were often difficult to define, let alone treat. But the emergence of shared hallucinations, an eerie, collective experience among several patients, challenged the very foundation of the medical theories they had been taught. It all began when a single patient started to describe strange, vivid visions, hallucinations of figures that didn't exist in the real world. At first, the hallucinations seemed harmless enough, albeit unsettling. The patient described seeing shadows that appeared to move, or hearing whispers in the silence of the night. Such reports were not uncommon in the history of asylums, where patients often experienced distorted perceptions of reality. But what made these reports so unusual was that other patients, without any prior contact with the first, began describing the same figures, the same sounds, and the same terrifying visions. These visions were not just subjective experiences, they were deeply shared, consistent across different individuals, and, most disturbingly, they seemed to have tangible qualities. Patients spoke of creatures lurking in the corners of the room, faces appearing at windows that couldn't have been there, and voices calling their names from the darkness. Soon, the reports of these shared hallucinations spread throughout the ward. The patients, in their isolation, had little opportunity to communicate with one another about their visions, yet they were all seeing the same things. The shared experience was so detailed and coherent that it seemed to transcend individual perception. The patients weren't simply describing vague feelings of unease. They were recounting the same figures, in the same places, at the same time. One patient would report seeing an immense shadow by the doorway, and moments later, another patient would begin describing the exact same shadow in identical detail. Some even claimed to see ghostly apparitions, figures dressed in traditional Japanese garments, their faces obscured, moving silently through the rooms, as though they were part of another time. These disturbing visions, seemingly unprovoked and unaffected by the passage of time, rapidly became the subject of intense scrutiny within the ward. What made this experience so unsettling for both the patients and the staff was not just the consistency of the hallucinations, but the intensity with which the patients experienced them. These weren't fleeting, passing visions. They were persistent, almost tangible, to the point where they seemed to interfere with the patient's ability to function. The patients who experienced the shared hallucinations became increasingly distressed and paranoid. They would refuse to sleep, convinced that the figures they saw would return in the dark. Some would attempt to barricade themselves in their rooms, while others would cry out in terror at the slightest noise. The sense of shared reality among the patients was so strong that it became difficult to separate the hallucinations from the patients' waking lives. For them, it was as though the boundary between the real world and the world of the mind had disappeared entirely. The response from the staff was mixed. Initially, the doctors were skeptical. They were trained to think of mental illness as a result of biological malfunction, problems with the brain, the nerves, or the body's chemical balance. The idea that a group of patients could all experience the same hallucination was unheard of. Some of the medical professionals began to theorize that it was simply a case of mass hysteria, a psychological condition where fear, stress, or suggestibility causes a group of people to experience the same delusions. Others thought that the patients were perhaps influencing each other's perceptions through a form of psychological contagion. But neither of these explanations felt entirely sufficient. Mass hysteria typically involved vague, unfocused delusions that would ebb and flow with time. What was happening in the Tokyo asylum was different. The hallucinations were persistent, specific, and shared by patients who had never spoken to each other about them. Over time, it became clear that the patients who were experiencing the hallucinations were not simply reacting to the same external stimuli. They were, in some strange and inexplicable way, connected. Whether this connection was psychological, spiritual, or something else entirely was the subject of much debate. The medical staff began to take a more active interest in the phenomenon, conducting interviews and recording the patient testimonies with increasing urgency. But despite their best efforts, no clear cause could be identified. Some patients spoke of seeing figures from Japanese folklore, like yokai or kami, supernatural beings that were believed to inhabit the natural world. Others claimed to see shadowy demons, spirits, or ancient warriors whose appearances seemed to align perfectly with the traditional imagery of Japan's spiritual past. For many of the patients, these visions were not just figments of their imaginations. They were part of a greater, more disturbing reality. As the phenomenon continued, it began to shape the atmosphere of the asylum itself. The ward became a place of shared fear, with patients feeding off each other's anxieties and reinforcing their collective delusions. The staff was unsure how to treat this unique condition. They were accustomed to dealing with individuals who were isolated in their hallucinations, not with groups of patients who seemed to experience the same delusions simultaneously. Isolation was one approach, but it didn't seem to stem the tide of the collective hallucinations. Medications and restraint, common methods of treatment at the time, were ineffective. There was no cure for this phenomenon, and no explanation that seemed to satisfy the medical professionals involved. As the weeks passed, the story of the asylum's mysterious mass hallucinations began to circulate among the medical community. Western doctors and scholars, many of whom had come to Japan to study psychiatry, were called in to investigate. They, too, were baffled by what they encountered. Despite their experience with cases of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and delusional disorders, they had never seen anything quite like this. The idea that several patients could experience the same hallucination, in the same way, at the same time, was a mystery that stretched the limits of their understanding. Even the most seasoned professionals could offer no definitive explanation. And so, the concept of collective hallucinations, though seemingly a modern curiosity, has intrigued psychologists and philosophers for centuries. But in 1899, the phenomenon occurring in the Tokyo Asylum was a revelation, an unsettling puzzle that demanded explanation. What was collective hallucination? How could multiple individuals, who were previously suffering from different mental afflictions, all experience the same disturbing visions, independently and simultaneously? To understand this, one must first explore the psychology behind hallucinations themselves, how they form, why they occur, and what makes them so personal to the individual. Yet the very nature of collective hallucination defied these ideas, suggesting that the mind might not be as isolated as we think. A hallucination is a perception in the absence of external stimuli. It can affect any of the senses, vision, hearing, smell, taste, or touch, and feels entirely real to the person experiencing it. Most often, hallucinations are associated with psychosis, a mental disorder in which a person loses contact with reality. They are commonly found in conditions like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, severe depression, or substance-induced psychosis. These individuals may see things that aren't there, hear voices, or perceive sensations that have no physical source. The images and sounds can vary from benign and fleeting to terrifying and persistent, and they can dramatically affect a person's ability to distinguish between the real world and their mind. Hallucinations, in these cases, are often isolated experiences, personal and subjective, shaped by an individual's mind, fears, desires, and psychological state. The standard understanding of hallucinations suggested that they were individual experiences. What was happening in the Tokyo Asylum, however, was something entirely different. Multiple patients, suffering from various mental conditions, were all experiencing the same visions so detailed and consistent that it seemed as if their minds were somehow linked. It was as if they had become part of a shared dream or collective nightmare. The doctors, initially confused, turned to mass hysteria as the only possible explanation. Mass hysteria, or mass psychogenic illness, is a phenomenon in which groups of people, often in isolated settings, exhibit similar symptoms, typically after being exposed to stress or fear. While it has often been used to explain outbreaks of inexplicable symptoms or behaviors, mass hysteria typically involves a more dispersed set of symptoms, ranging from dizziness to fainting to paranoia. It's rooted in suggestibility, a psychological condition where a person's behavior or perceptions can be influenced by the thoughts or actions of others. This, however, didn't fully explain the experience of the patients in the asylum, who were not just displaying symptoms but were immersed in a shared, vivid hallucination that aligned in uncanny detail. The idea of collective hallucination forces us to ask deeper questions about the nature of reality and perception. Can the mind be influenced by something outside itself, such as the environment, the people around it, or even the very air? The answer, perhaps, lies in a relatively obscure psychological concept called shared psychosis, also known as folie à deux. This term refers to the rare condition in which two or more people, often in close relationships, begin to share a delusional belief. The influence of one individual's thoughts and perceptions on another's is profound, so much so that the delusions become indistinguishable. While the typical case of folie à deux involves two individuals, often isolated, feeding off each other's delusions, the phenomenon in Tokyo was much broader. It wasn't just two patients experiencing the same delusion, it was a group of patients, seemingly separated from one another by their own individual conditions, who began sharing a singular, vivid, terrifying vision. The question then becomes, why did this happen in the Tokyo Asylum? Why did a ward full of patients, some of whom had little in common except their location and mental state, suddenly experience shared hallucinations? One possible explanation lies in the concept of psychological contagion. This theory suggests that thoughts, emotions, and behaviors can spread from person to person like a virus, especially in environments where individuals are highly suggestible and emotionally vulnerable. The asylum, with its oppressive atmosphere, isolation, and stress, created an environment ripe for such contagion. The patients, cut off from their families and society, found themselves in a place where fear and anxiety could easily spread from one individual to the next. The power of suggestion, the idea that one person's delusions could influence another's, became a dominant force in the asylum. Psychological contagion doesn't just explain how ideas or emotions can spread. It also suggests that, under the right conditions, a group of people might begin to experience the same symptoms, or even the same visions, because they have been primed by their environment. This creates a feedback loop. One person reports a hallucination, which causes another person to experience something similar, and so on. This idea begins to form the basis of the shared hallucinations in Tokyo. The patients, each dealing with their own internal struggles, be it schizophrenia, depression, or hysteria, were suddenly exposed to a common experience. The visions they described were, to their minds, real and inextricable from the reality they occupied. What began as a solitary hallucination for one patient spread through the ward, creating an environment in which shared experiences could take root. But why did this particular group of patients experience these specific hallucinations? Why were they all seeing the same things? Figures, creatures, shadows, and scenes from a shared but inexplicable reality? This question delves into the complexity of the mind itself. Some theories suggest that when the mind is under extreme stress, it becomes more susceptible to irrational thoughts or perceptions. The psychiatric conditions of the patients in the Tokyo asylum, combined with the trauma of being confined to an institution and subjected to treatments they may not have understood, could have acted as a trigger. Their shared mental distress created a fertile ground for their minds to concoct similar visions, linked by common fears or psychological themes. Another possibility lies in the realm of cultural influence. Japan, at the time, was deeply steeped in spiritual beliefs, with shamanism, Buddhism, and various local superstitions still influencing everyday life. The idea of spirits and supernatural forces was not just relegated to folklore. It was an accepted part of Japanese culture. In the 19th century, many Japanese still believed in the power of the spirit world to influence the living. It's possible that these deeply embedded cultural beliefs played a role in the patient's hallucinations. When they experienced something as strange and inexplicable as the shared visions, their minds, conditioned by cultural narratives and anxieties, might have projected these visions onto a supernatural framework. The patients weren't simply seeing things, they were seeing things that fit within their culturally influenced expectations. Yokai, kami, and ghosts from folklore could easily fill the roles of the figures they described. For example, a patient might have described seeing a shadowy figure in the corner of the room, a figure that many would describe as a yurei or spirit. The influence of cultural beliefs, combined with the patient's shared distress, might have primed them to interpret these hallucinations through the lens of the supernatural. When other patients, unaware of one another's visions, described similar experiences, the power of cultural symbols and shared beliefs became clear. It wasn't just mass hysteria, it was a manifestation of something more deeply rooted, a connection between the mind's psychological state and its cultural framework. Despite these possible explanations, the true nature of the collective hallucinations in the Tokyo asylum remains elusive. Some have argued that it was a matter of psychosomatic contagion, that the patients' minds, already fragile from their mental illnesses, became susceptible to a shared delusion because of their shared environment. Others contend that there is something more profound at play, that the mind, in its most extreme states, is capable of transcending the boundaries of individual consciousness, linking the thoughts, perceptions, and experiences of multiple people in a way that defies our current understanding of psychology. The experience of collective hallucination poses uncomfortable questions about the human mind's ability to influence and be influenced by others. Can we truly separate individual reality from a collective reality? Are our perceptions of the world around us entirely personal, or are we, in some sense, always connected to others? The events in Tokyo, while rooted in the specific cultural and historical context of Japan at the time, hint at a more universal truth. The mind is not a solitary entity, but rather a dynamic, interactive system, influenced by the world around it in ways that are still not fully understood. And when pushed to extremes, as in the asylum, the mind may find itself linked not just to the present moment, but to the cultural narratives, fears, and beliefs that have shaped humanity for centuries. What happened in Tokyo wasn't just a case of collective hallucinations, it was a glimpse into the mysterious and intricate nature of human consciousness itself. As the collective hallucinations at the Tokyo Asylum continued to intensify, the medical staff found themselves at the mercy of an enigma that seemed to defy their professional training. In the face of this strange and persistent phenomenon, there was no textbook explanation, no precedent for such an occurrence. The situation began to spiral beyond what the doctors could comprehend or control. The patients, each diagnosed with their own distinct mental illnesses, were now experiencing a shared, bizarre reality that seemed to span the borders of personal delusion and collective perception. It wasn't just that they were all seeing strange figures or hearing voices. The hallucinatory experiences were so specific, so vivid, that they could no longer be dismissed as mere subjective experiences. The patients weren't simply losing touch with reality. They were immersed in a collective reality of their own. A question that had seemed theoretical was now at the forefront of everyone's mind. Was this mass psychosis, or was it something deeper? Something that reached beyond the capacities of psychology and psychiatry to explain? For the medical staff, the most immediate concern was the intensity of the patient's suffering. These were not passive, fleeting hallucinations that came and went. These were persistent, unrelenting visions that seemed to take on lives of their own. The patient's fear was palpable. They described creatures and figures that defied logic and reason. Towering shadows, faces with no eyes, and dark, looming figures that seemed to move within the walls of the asylum. The visions were not just figments of their imaginations. They were real to them, as real as the world outside the asylum. For some patients, these hallucinations were so terrifying that they became physically incapacitated. They would cower in their rooms, refusing to sleep for fear of the figures they had seen, or worse, the ones they knew would return. Others would become agitated, frantically searching the rooms for the invisible creatures that haunted them. Their behavior became erratic, disconnected from anything in the real world, as they struggled to navigate a reality where the rules of the visible world no longer applied. The situation in the asylum grew more chaotic as the days passed. Doctors attempted to isolate the patients, hoping to stop the spread of the hallucinations by keeping them from interacting with each other. But the very act of isolation seemed to intensify the symptoms. New patients who arrived at the ward, unaware of what had been happening, quickly began experiencing the same visions. It wasn't long before the asylum had descended into a state of pervasive fear. The patients, once isolated in their mental afflictions, were now part of a collective experience, bound together by the terror that had taken root in their minds. The asylum had become a microcosm of madness, where the lines between reality and delusion blurred beyond recognition. The medical staff were unable to prevent the spread of these visions, despite their best efforts. They tried to apply traditional treatments, physical restraint, isolation, and even early forms of electroconvulsive therapy, but nothing seemed to have any effect. Medications were either unavailable or ineffective, and the treatments of the time were crude at best. The doctors were left with no real solution, and as the phenomenon spread, the idea of mass hysteria gained traction among some in the medical community. Yet, mass hysteria didn't explain the specificity of the hallucinations, nor the shared nature of the experience. Mass hysteria typically involved a dispersed set of symptoms that varied from person to person, with no clear unifying theme. What was happening at the Tokyo Asylum, however, was different. The patients weren't simply reacting to the same external stimuli or displaying a wide range of symptoms. They were seeing the same figures, the same darkness, and the same voices. It was as though the hallucinations were being shared by multiple minds that had no reason to be connected, but somehow were. As the doctors attempted to make sense of the phenomenon, the patients continued to spiral into deeper states of distress. For some, the hallucinations began to take on more disturbing qualities. They weren't just seeing figures, they were seeing creatures, shadowy, almost formless beings that moved in and out of their perceptions. These figures were often described as monstrous, disfigured, and terrifying. There were reports of towering figures with glowing eyes, or grotesque creatures that seemed to slither across the floor or crawl out of the walls. Some patients described hearing whispers that came from nowhere, or being followed by unseen presences that stalked them in the corridors of the asylum. The fear these visions instilled was visceral, and the patients reacted to them as though they were real, as though the boundary between the hallucination and the physical world had been erased. As the doctors began to consider more unconventional explanations, they turned to the idea of shared psychosis or folia plusieurs. In rare cases, a group of individuals, often living in close proximity, could become affected by a delusion that spread among them like a contagion. In these cases, The psychological condition wasn't limited to a single person. It infected a group, causing everyone to experience the same delusion or hallucination. The theory of psychological contagion suggested that when one person in the asylum began describing the same strange visions, or when the fear began to take root, other patients might be unknowingly influenced, eventually developing similar hallucinations of their own. However, this theory, too, had its limitations. The very nature of the hallucinations, their vividness, their consistency across different patients, suggested that this was more than just the spread of a delusional belief. The patients weren't just influenced by one another's fear, they were experiencing something objectively shared. The mystery deepened when doctors began to notice that the hallucinations seemed to be consistent, even when patients had no opportunity to communicate. Patients in separate rooms, who had never interacted, began describing the same visions, sometimes with such detail that it was impossible to chalk it up to coincidence. One patient described seeing a dark, hooded figure standing in the corner of her room, and within hours, another patient began to describe the same figure, down to the flowing cloak and the intensity of its gaze. These visions were not just vague impressions of something frightening, they were carefully constructed and detailed, as if the minds of the patients were all tapping into the same source of imagery. What was this source? Was it purely psychological, or was there something else at play, something beyond the confines of the individual mind? The medical staff, already overwhelmed, began to question their understanding of the human psyche. Could the mind really be influenced to such an extent that multiple individuals could experience the same delusion simultaneously? Or was there something in the environment, the isolation of the asylum, the oppressive atmosphere, or even the psychological stress of the patients, that was triggering a shared psychological experience? Theories began to emerge, ranging from chemical imbalances in the brain, to the influence of the psychiatric ward itself, to the possibility of some supernatural influence. But nothing could provide a clear answer. The medical community, at a loss for explanations, began to treat the patients as though they were living in a shared nightmare, and the entire asylum became a cocoon of fear and terror, where the boundaries between the mind's inner world and the external world seemed to collapse. In the face of growing panic and confusion, the asylum's doctors began reaching out to experts from outside Japan. Western psychologists and psychiatrists who had studied mass psychosis or shared delusions were invited to examine the phenomenon. These experts, too, were at a loss. Despite their experience with mental illness and the study of the human mind, they had never encountered such a complex case of collective delusion. The idea that multiple patients, diagnosed with different mental conditions, could all experience the same vivid hallucinations was not only baffling but also unsettling. It suggested that the human mind was capable of something far beyond what was understood at the time, a shared experience that extended beyond the confines of the individual self. As the asylum staff and visiting experts struggled to comprehend what was happening, the patients continued to deteriorate. Some became more deeply entrenched in their delusions, unable to separate the visions from their daily lives. Others, unable to cope with the intensity of their experiences, began to withdraw, retreating into a state of complete isolation. The doctors, their hands tied by the limitations of 19th century psychiatry, were left powerless. Their scientific approach to mental illness seemed inadequate in the face of a collective experience that couldn't be explained by biology or psychology. And so, the patients of the Tokyo Asylum remained trapped in their shared hallucinations, as the medical staff continued to search for answers that would remain elusive for many years to come. In the absence of any clear solution, the story of the Tokyo Asylum and its collective hallucinations became an unsettling mystery, a phenomenon that hinted at something far deeper and more profound than the doctors could have imagined. What had started as a medical curiosity soon evolved into a haunting reminder of the mind's potential for mystery and uncertainty. The patients, the doctors, and even the experts who came to study them were left with one inescapable truth. There were parts of the human mind that could not be controlled, understood, or explained. As the strange phenomenon continued to unfold within the walls of the Tokyo Asylum, a deep sense of unease settled over the medical staff and the patients alike. The idea that something beyond the ordinary mechanisms of the mind was at play seemed increasingly plausible. The question of whether this was simply a bizarre case of mass hysteria, or something more deeply rooted in the human psyche, lingered in the air like a thick fog. The more the doctors observed, the more it became clear that the hallucinations were not isolated, random occurrences, but part of a larger, interconnected psychological event. What they were witnessing might have been a glimpse into the deepest corners of the human mind, where individual reality merged into a collective, terrifying experience. Despite their best efforts to find a scientific explanation, The medical professionals at the asylum were trapped by their own inability to truly understand the phenomenon. They had been trained to think in individualistic terms, where each patient's experiences and symptoms were isolated to their own minds, shaped by personal trauma, biology, or pathology. But the events at the asylum seemed to blur the boundaries between individual consciousness and the shared experience of others. The patients, many of whom had never interacted with one another, were all describing the same visions, hearing the same sounds, and experiencing the same terrifying figures. The notion that the mind could be so profoundly interconnected, that the hallucinations could be shared among individuals in such vivid detail, was an idea that pushed the limits of contemporary psychiatry. At the time, even the most well-known psychiatrists and psychologists, such as Sigmund Freud and Emil Kraepelin, had yet to fully grasp the implications of this collective experience. The implications of the shared hallucinations weren't just clinical, they were existential. They pointed to a fundamental uncertainty about the nature of human consciousness itself. If multiple people could experience the same delusions, what did this say about the mind's relationship with reality? Were these hallucinations the product of external factors, such as the environment within the asylum, or were they emerging from a deeper, more unknown part of the human psyche? The patient's shared experiences seemed to suggest that the boundaries between individual realities were more fluid than anyone had imagined. The more the asylum's doctors struggled to contain the situation, the more they began to confront the unsettling possibility that their understanding of the human mind was not only incomplete, but deeply flawed. The idea of a shared psychic experience was not new, nor was it entirely foreign to the medical community. There had been cases in the past where patients, especially in isolated communities, had reported experiencing similar visions or delusions. Some historians have pointed to instances of mass delusions or visions among religious sects or cultures, where groups of people would claim to have had identical supernatural experiences. But the Tokyo Asylum was different. This was a modern, scientific institution, grounded in the new wave of psychiatric understanding that was emerging at the time. And yet, even within this environment, the limits of rational thought were being tested. There was something uniquely unnerving about the consistency of the hallucinations. As more patients arrived, they were quickly swept into the vortex of this shared experience. They described seeing the same figures, dark, indistinct shapes that seemed to move with purpose, like shadowy phantoms from a nightmare. The figures were often seen at the periphery of the patient's vision, flickering just outside their direct line of sight. Others reported hearing whispers that spoke in a language they didn't recognize, or seeing faces that seemed to appear out of nowhere, lingering just long enough to instill a sense of overwhelming dread. Some patients described feeling as though they were being watched, even when no one was present in the room. The hallucinations were so consistent and terrifying that they seemed to become real in the patient's minds, and it was only through medical intervention, or sheer willpower, that they could eventually separate themselves from the terrifying world their minds had created. But how could this be? How could a group of individuals, each with their own personal struggles and histories, experience the same delusion, at the same time, in such vivid detail? The idea that the mind could somehow sync up with others' minds, despite being separated by physical space, was a radical notion, one that did not fit within the boundaries of medical science at the time. The asylum doctors were now faced with a dilemma that extended beyond the practicalities of treatment. They were confronted with a mystery that reached into the very heart of human consciousness. The possibility that a shared experience of this magnitude could exist, that the mind could extend beyond the individual and into a collective space, was a terrifying thought, one that suggested that reality itself might not be as solid or immutable as they had once believed. As the days turned into weeks, the psychiatric community's response to the Tokyo Asylum case grew increasingly divided. On one hand, some doctors still clung to the traditional explanations, that this was simply an outbreak of mass hysteria. The prevailing view in Western psychiatry at the time held that mass hysteria was an easily understandable phenomenon. It was a condition that arose in groups of people who were exposed to high levels of stress or fear, and it could result in the spread of irrational behavior or delusions. But what was happening at the asylum went beyond what could be explained by sheer emotional contagion. The hallucinations, after all, weren't vague or nonspecific. They were deeply consistent and even structured, suggesting that there was something more at play than simply emotional contagion or suggestion. On the other hand, some doctors began to entertain more speculative theories. They wondered if the shared hallucinations might be the result of a psychic contagion, a form of collective consciousness where the minds of the patients were somehow attuned to one another. Could it be that the minds of individuals within the asylum were communicating with one another on a psychic level, bypassing the usual channels of interaction and sharing the same hallucinations? Could it be that the asylum itself, its isolation, its claustrophobia, its oppressive atmosphere, was acting as a kind of psychic amplifier, creating a shared psychic space that allowed the patients to experience each other's delusions as though they were real? It was a theory that seemed almost laughable at the time, but in light of the inexplicable experiences unfolding in the ward, it began to hold a certain unsettling plausibility. Some patients who had been experiencing the hallucinations reported feeling as though they were not simply seeing the figures, but connecting with them. They would describe interactions with these shadowy beings, speaking to them in a language that was not their own. The figures, they claimed, would respond to their questions, offering cryptic answers that hinted at a deeper meaning. These interactions were not just visual experiences. They felt real in a way that went beyond mere perception. For the patients, the figures in their hallucinations were not merely figments of imagination. They were entities that existed outside of their minds, each with its own will, purpose, and presence. Some patients even began to report feeling compelled to follow the figures, or to engage with them in ways that felt almost ritualistic. As the situation in the asylum worsened, the medical staff began to experiment with different methods of intervention. In their desperation, some doctors turned to restraint and isolation, hoping that keeping the patients apart from each other would stop the spread of the hallucinations. Others attempted to administer sedatives or even early forms of electroconvulsive therapy in an effort to subdue the symptoms. But nothing seemed to work. The more the staff tried to control the situation, the more uncontrollable it became. It was as though the patients' collective minds had formed a network, an invisible web that bound them together in their shared delusion, one that could not be easily severed. The inability to find a solution only deepened the sense of despair that hung over the asylum. The medical community was forced to confront the limits of their knowledge, to acknowledge that there were aspects of the mind that could not be understood through the tools available to them. As the patient's experiences persisted, the idea of a collective psyche, one that transcended individual consciousness, began to take shape in the minds of some doctors. The more the phenomenon unfolded, the more it suggested that the mind was not a solitary, isolated entity, but something that could be shaped and influenced by forces outside of itself, by the environment, by the people around it, and perhaps by something even more mysterious. The idea of a shared delusion, or a shared hallucination, was no longer simply a curiosity. It had become a question that reached to the heart of what it meant to be human. Could the mind truly be connected in such an intimate way with others? Could reality itself be so fluid, so open to interpretation and suggestion, that the boundaries between individual experience and collective experience could blur? The patients of the Tokyo Asylum, trapped in their shared visions, were now part of a collective mystery that no one could fully explain or control. Their hallucinations had become a living, breathing part of their reality, a reality that extended beyond the confines of their individual minds. What they were experiencing was not just a breakdown of their own consciousness, it was a breakdown of the very idea of reality itself. And as the doctors and experts struggled to understand what was happening, they were forced to confront the possibility that the human mind was far more complex and far more connected than they had ever imagined. The growing mystery of the collective hallucinations at the Tokyo Asylum raised profound questions about the nature of reality itself. As the situation escalated, the asylum became a microcosm of psychological collapse, an isolated universe where the normal laws of perception seemed no longer to apply. The patients, who had once been mere individuals with their own private struggles and afflictions, were now bound together by a shared delusion, one that united them in a terrifying experience that none of them could escape. The visions, the shadowy figures, the whispering voices, and the sense of unseen forces moving in and around them became a reality in itself, one that the patients lived in, breathed in, and could not fully distance themselves from. It wasn't just a breakdown of the mind, it was a breakdown of reality, where the line between the external world and the internal world blurred beyond recognition. The doctors, still struggling to understand what was happening, began to entertain the idea that the asylum itself, with its oppressive atmosphere, might be playing a significant role in the patient's experiences. The building, a hulking structure of stone and wood, had once been a traditional institution, designed for the confinement of those deemed mentally ill, but it was now evolving into a kind of dark sanctuary for shared delusions. Was it possible that the physical environment, the walls, the narrow corridors, the isolation, was somehow contributing to the intensity of the hallucinations? Could the very space the patients inhabited be creating or amplifying their shared visions? The architecture of the asylum, with its Gothic undertones and labyrinthine layout, had always been a symbol of confinement. But now, it seemed to take on a new significance. It became a psychic prison, trapping both the mind and the body in a world where nothing could be trusted or understood. The psychiatric ward, with its bare walls and dim lighting, created an environment that was devoid of any external reference points. There were no windows to the outside world, no markers of time, no connection to the broader reality of the world beyond the asylum's confines. It was as though the asylum itself had become a separate dimension, a place where reality could be manufactured in ways that no one fully understood. The patients, already vulnerable due to their mental conditions, were now living in an environment that amplified their fears, their confusion, and their distrust of the outside world. In a sense, the asylum had become not just a place for treatment, but a breeding ground for delusion, a place where the boundaries between reality and imagination were constantly shifting. The isolation within the asylum was another key factor. Many of the patients had been admitted for reasons that were deeply personal. Some suffered from long-standing psychiatric conditions, others from trauma, while some had been abandoned by their families and left with little to no support. The loneliness they experienced in the asylum was profound, not just in the physical sense, but in the psychological sense as well. They were cut off from the world, from their loved ones, from any sense of normality or grounding. The loss of connection to the world outside created an emotional and mental vacuum, one that left them vulnerable to the psychic contagion that seemed to be spreading among them. It was as though, in their isolation, their minds were more susceptible to the suggestions and fears of the others around them. As the hallucinations spread from one patient to the next, they were no longer isolated incidents. They became part of a larger, interconnected web of fear and delusion, a web that grew stronger the more it was fed. In an effort to break the cycle of hallucinations, the doctors began to examine the potential for external influences that could be triggering the patient's experiences. One possibility they explored was the role of suggestion. It was well known that human beings, especially those who are mentally vulnerable, could be profoundly influenced by external stimuli, by what they saw, heard, and experienced in their environment. If one patient began describing a vision or a hallucination, could it be that the suggestion of that experience was enough to trigger similar experiences in others? The idea of contagion in psychology was not new. It had been observed in smaller instances, such as in religious or cultural settings, where a single person's experience could spread through a group, affecting everyone's perception of reality. In the asylum, this psychic contagion seemed to be taking hold. The more patients shared their experiences of the visions, the more others seemed to fall into the same delusional pattern. But the nature of the hallucinations in the Tokyo asylum went beyond simple suggestion. These were not random, vague experiences. They were deeply specific, consistent in their imagery, and terrifying in their detail. Some patients would describe seeing shadowy figures or ghostly apparitions in such similar terms that it was impossible to dismiss the phenomenon as mere chance. One patient described a figure that had no face, only a shadowy outline, standing in the corner of their room. Another patient, hours later, described the same figure in the same location, without ever having spoken to the first patient. The consistency of these visions suggested that the hallucinations were not simply the product of suggestion, but something more complex. It was as if the patients' minds had tapped into a shared psychic pool, where the same images, figures, and experiences could be accessed by all who were vulnerable to the influence of the environment.